There is a paradox sitting at the heart of every human interaction you have ever had. The harder you push, the more resistance you create. The more desperately you want something from another person, the less likely they are to give it. The louder you argue your case, the more firmly the other person plants their feet against you. You have felt this. Every single person alive has felt this, and most people respond to it by pushing harder, arguing louder, wanting more desperately, and then wondering why nothing changes. What if the entire strategy was wrong from the beginning? Reverse psychology is not a trick. It is not a manipulation technique pulled from a cheap self-help article. It is a profound and ancient understanding of how the human mind actually works, of how desire is created and destroyed, of how resistance forms and dissolves, of how the will to control another person almost always guarantees that control will never be achieved. It is the understanding that the most direct path between 2 points in human psychology is almost never a straight line. The 14 laws you are about to encounter will change how you see every conversation, every negotiation, every relationship, and every attempt you have ever made to influence the world around you. They will show you that the secret to moving people is learning to step back, that the secret to being heard is learning to stop speaking, and that the secret to getting what you want is learning, with great precision and even greater patience, how to want it differently. The first law begins exactly where you are right now. Law 1. The law of reverse desire. Want less to receive more. This is the law that everything else in this book rests upon, so it deserves the most careful attention, the most honest examination, and the most thorough unpacking before we move to anything else. Because if you understand this law truly, not just intellectually but in your bones, you will already have changed the way you operate in every relationship and every interaction in your life. Here is the central truth of the law of reverse desire. Human beings are psychologically drawn toward what appears to be moving away from them and psychologically repelled by what appears to be moving toward them with too much urgency. This is not a rule someone invented. It is a feature of how the human nervous system reads the world. We are, at our deepest level, creatures who assign value based on scarcity and apparent desirability. What is rare seems precious. What is abundantly available and urgently offered seems suspect. Think about the last time someone wanted something from you with obvious, visible intensity. Perhaps it was a salesperson who was clearly desperate to close the deal. Perhaps it was a person romantically interested in you who made their interest known in a way that felt overwhelming. Perhaps it was a friend who needed your approval or agreement so badly that you could feel the need emanating from them like heat. What was your internal response to that need? For most people, the honest answer is that it was some combination of discomfort, caution, and a quiet but definite pull away from the thing being wanted so urgently. Now think about the reverse. Think about the person or opportunity that seemed indifferent to whether you engaged or not. The romantic interest who was clearly interesting and clearly interested, but also clearly fine if things did not develop. The opportunity that presented itself without fanfare and did not seem to be waiting anxiously for your acceptance. The person in the negotiation who seemed entirely comfortable walking away if the terms were not right. How did your internal response to that differ? For most people, the answer is considerably. The law of reverse desire explains this dynamic at its psychological root. When something or someone appears to need you, the power in the relationship flows toward you. You become the one with options. You become the one who can choose. And because human beings are deeply status conscious, this shift in relational power tends to reduce rather than increase our attraction and our willingness to give what is being wanted. When something or someone appears not to need you, when they are self-contained and self-directed and have a visible sufficiency that does not depend on your response, the power flows the other way. Suddenly, you are the one who might be excluded. Suddenly, the choice is theirs to make rather than yours. And the psychology of possible exclusion, of potential scarcity, of something you might not be able to have if you do not act, creates the very desire that desperate wanting never produces. This is why the most magnetic people in any social or professional context tend to be the ones who appear to want the least, who are genuinely engaged, genuinely warm, genuinely interested, but who carry with them an unmistakable quality of self-sufficiency. They are not performing indifference. That would be a crude imitation of this law and would fail accordingly. They are genuinely invested in their own direction, their own projects, their own values and goals, to the degree that the approval or engagement of any particular person or group is genuinely not required for their sense of completeness. And paradoxically, that genuine self-sufficiency is enormously attractive. It creates in others the desire to be included, to be noticed, to be chosen by this person who does not appear to need choosing, because being chosen by someone who had genuine options means something. Being chosen by someone who was desperate for any taker means almost nothing. The practical application of this law is not about becoming cold or detached or artificially unavailable. It is about something much more important: genuinely investing in yourself, your purpose, your capabilities, and your direction, to the point where your sense of well-being and your forward momentum do not depend on any particular person's response. When you build that genuine self-direction, the law of reverse desire begins to operate naturally, not as a strategy, but as a byproduct of actually having a life that you are genuinely engaged with. There is a particular application of this law in negotiation that is worth examining closely. The single most powerful position in any negotiation is what strategists call the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It is the genuinely attractive option you have if the current negotiation does not produce a satisfactory outcome. When you have a real and attractive alternative, your desire for the deal in front of you is naturally calibrated. You are not desperate. You are interested, but not needy. And that quality of non-desperate interest is the position from which the best negotiated outcomes are almost always achieved. But even in contexts far less formal than a business negotiation, the principle is the same. The person who comes to any conversation with a genuine alternative, with other good options for how they spend their time and energy and emotional investment, brings a quality of self-possession to that conversation that changes its dynamic entirely. They are not performing non-neediness. They actually have other places to be and other things to value. And that reality, felt by the other person even when not stated, creates a very different kind of attention than the attention paid to someone who clearly has nowhere else to go. The law of reverse desire also applies to how you communicate your interest in ideas and outcomes. The person who presents their proposal with a quality of take it or leave it, who has clearly thought carefully about it and believes in it and is willing to stand behind it, but who does not seem to need the other party to agree, tends to encounter less resistance than the person who clearly wants agreement desperately and tries to overcome resistance by arguing harder. Because arguing harder confirms that the resistance is having an effect. It signals that the resistance matters to you, that you need it to dissolve. And that signal increases the other party's sense of leverage, which almost always makes them hold their position more firmly rather than less. Wanting less, in the domain of interpersonal influence, is not a sacrifice. It is a strategy. And more than a strategy, it is a form of genuine freedom. Because the person who genuinely needs less is genuinely more powerful, not in the sense of being able to force outcomes, but in the far more important sense of being able to choose outcomes that actually serve them rather than accepting whatever they can get in their state of desperation. Law 2, the law of the forbidden fruit. Tell someone they cannot have something to make them want it. Every parent of a young child knows this law intuitively, even if they could not articulate the psychology behind it. The toy that was ignored for weeks suddenly becomes the most desired object in the house the moment another child reaches for it. The book left untouched on the shelf becomes urgently interesting the moment someone suggests it might not be appropriate for the child to read. The activity that generated endless resistance becomes appealing the moment it is declared off-limits. This is not a quirk of childhood psychology. It is one of the most consistent and powerful features of the adult mind as well. The psychology behind the law of the forbidden fruit is called psychological reactance. It is a term coined by the social psychologist Jack Brem in his foundational work on the subject, and it describes something fundamental in the structure of human motivation. When people perceive that their freedom to have or do or think something is being restricted, They experience an immediate motivational response aimed at restoring that freedom. The restricted thing becomes more desirable, not less. The restriction itself becomes the advertisement. This is why prohibition, in virtually every form it has ever been tried, produces the opposite of its intended effect. Prohibiting alcohol does not reduce the desire for alcohol. It dramatically increases it, while simultaneously increasing the social cachet of obtaining it. Prohibiting certain books does not reduce the desire to read them. It creates a hunger for their content that the books might never have generated on their own merits. Prohibiting access to information does not reduce curiosity about that information. It transforms it from mild interest into urgent necessity. The same dynamic operates at the most intimate levels of personal and social interaction. The romantic partner who says you will never be good enough for me has discovered, however accidentally, one of the most powerful desire-generating statements in the human emotional lexicon. Not because it is kind, not because it is true, but because it activates the reactance drive in the most personal and motivating way possible, turning the question of adequacy into an urgent project of self-proving. The law of the forbidden fruit has several important applications in the psychology of influence. The first is the application of strategic unavailability. When you make yourself or your attention or your approval somewhat difficult to access, not impossible, not coldly withholding, but genuinely engaged elsewhere and available only selectively, you trigger a mild form of the reactance drive in the people who want your attention. They begin to want it more, not less. Your presence becomes more valuable because it is not automatic. The second application is the art of the gentle prohibition. In contexts where you want someone to move toward a particular choice or direction, the direct suggestion often triggers resistance, because direct suggestions feel like attempts to restrict choice. But the indirect suggestion, or even better, the gentle apparent discouragement, can activate the reactance drive in the direction you want it to go. This is the technique used by the legendary sales professional who, looking at a customer examining a product, says thoughtfully, "You know, I am not sure that one is right for you. It might be more than you need." The customer, whose reactance drive has just been activated by what sounds like a limit on their access to the product, immediately wants to know more about it. They become the one pursuing the sale, rather than the one being sold to. And in that reversal of roles, the entire dynamic of the transaction changes. The third application is the principle of the implied elite. When membership in a group, access to information, or participation in an experience is framed as something not everyone qualifies for, the desirability of that membership, access, or experience increases dramatically. This is the psychology behind exclusive clubs, invitation-only platforms, limited edition products, and the velvet rope at the entrance to a venue. The restriction itself is the message. It says, this is something that not everyone can have, and that message, more than any quality the thing itself might possess, creates desire. The ethical application of this law requires a crucial distinction. There is a difference between creating genuine scarcity or genuine standards for access, and manufacturing false scarcity or false standards to manipulate behavior. The genuine version of this law creates real value. High standards of membership in a community genuinely protect the quality of that community. Genuine selectivity in who you give your time and attention to genuinely reflects the value of your time and attention. The manufactured version, the artificial limitation designed purely to exploit the reactance drive, is a manipulation that creates short-term desire but long-term resentment when the manufactured nature of the restriction becomes apparent. And it almost always does become apparent, because people are more perceptive than manipulators tend to give them credit for. The wise application of the law of the forbidden fruit, then, is the application that rests on genuine scarcity and genuine standards rather than theater. Make what you offer actually rare. Set actual standards for what you give your time and energy to. Create actual quality and actual exclusivity rather than performing them. Because when the forbidden fruit is genuinely rare and genuinely worth having, the desire it generates is real, and the people who pursue it are pursuing something that will actually reward their pursuit. Law 3. The law of reverse pressure. The harder you push, the stronger the wall becomes. There is a principle in physics called Newton's third law of motion, which states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Human psychology has its own version of this principle, and it is at least as reliable. The harder you push against another person's position, the harder they push back. The more pressure you apply to make someone change, the more energy they invest in not changing. The more forcefully you argue, the more committed they become to the position you are arguing against. This is the law of reverse pressure, and it explains more failed attempts at persuasion, negotiation, and interpersonal influence than almost any other single principle in this book. Why does pressure produce counter-pressure? Because pressure is experienced as a threat to autonomy. When someone pushes you to change your position, your mind does not primarily hear the content of their argument. It hears the implicit message, "You are wrong, and I am right, and you should do what I say." And that implicit message, whatever the content surrounding it, activates the same psychological machinery as any other perceived threat. The defenses rise. The position hardens. The capacity for genuine consideration of the other view diminishes. This is not stubbornness in the pejorative sense, though it is often described that way. It is a natural and in many ways healthy response of a mind that is trying to preserve its sense of autonomy and self-determination in the face of something that feels like an attack on those things. Even when the person applying the pressure is entirely correct. Even when the position they are pushing against is genuinely mistaken. The mechanism of reactance means that the method of pressure will often prevent the very change it is trying to create. The law of reverse pressure suggests a radically different approach to the challenge of helping another person move from a position you believe is wrong or harmful. Instead of applying pressure toward the desired change, you remove pressure from it. Instead of arguing for the new position, you become curious about the old one. Instead of pushing them away from where they are, you invite them to examine where they are more deeply and on their own terms. This is the approach that the most skilled therapists, counselors, negotiators, and change agents have independently arrived at through their practical experience with the limits of direct pressure. It is sometimes called motivational interviewing in the clinical context, but its principles operate wherever genuine change in another person's thinking or behavior is the goal. The first principle within this law is what we might call the principle of expressed curiosity. Instead of telling someone why they are wrong, you become genuinely curious about why they hold the position they hold. You ask questions, real questions, not rhetorical ones disguised as arguments, but questions aimed at genuinely understanding the structure and the logic and the emotional foundation of the position you want to help them move away from. And something remarkable often happens when you do this. When a person is invited to examine and explain their own position thoroughly, without pressure and without judgment, they sometimes begin to discover its weaknesses on their own. Because our positions are often maintained by a kind of psychological inertia rather than by careful, current reasoning. We adopted them at some point, they worked for us, and we have continued holding them without revisiting whether they still serve us. When we are invited to re-examine them in a supportive, non-pressured environment, we often find that our own thinking has moved on without our having officially updated our stated position. The second principle within this law is what we might call the principle of the acknowledged strength. Before engaging with the weaknesses of another person's position, you genuinely acknowledge its strengths, not in a manipulative, strategically insincere way, but in a real way. Because most positions, even wrong ones, contain something true, or at least something understandable. They were arrived at for reasons. They served some function. They addressed some real concern. Acknowledging that reality does something important. It tells the other person that you are engaging with their actual thinking rather than with a cartoon version of it. And when a person feels genuinely heard and genuinely credited, their defenses lower, and the possibility of genuine reconsideration opens up. The third principle is the principle of the questioned assumption. Rather than challenging a conclusion directly, you become curious about the assumptions that support it. You ask, gently and without implied judgment, What would need to be true for this position to make sense? And then you explore together whether those things are in fact true. This approach is far more effective than direct challenge because it does not feel like an attack on the person's conclusion. It feels like a shared inquiry into the foundations of an idea. And ideas whose foundations do not hold tend to fall of their own weight when examined carefully, without needing to be knocked down from the outside. The law of reverse pressure ultimately asks something difficult of the person who wants to use it: patience. Because removing pressure and creating space for another person to move toward change on their own terms is considerably slower than applying direct force. The temptation to just tell them why they are wrong and make them see it is always present, especially when you are certain you are right, and they are wrong. But certainty, however justified, does not change the psychology of pressure. The wall does not become less solid because you are definitely correct about the direction you want the person to go. The equal and opposite reaction does not diminish because your argument is genuinely better than theirs. The only thing that reduces the wall is removing the pressure that is creating it. And removing the pressure requires the willingness to trust that a person, given genuine space and genuine support for their own thinking process, will often find their own way to the destination you wanted them to reach, faster and more permanently than any amount of pushing would have gotten them there. Law 4. The law of the stepped-back leader. Lead by appearing to follow. Power, in most people's imagination, looks like someone at the front. The one who points the direction, who sets the terms, who issues the instructions and monitors the compliance. This is the visible model of leadership that most of us absorbed from every institution we have ever been part of: school, family, workplace, government. Someone is in charge. Someone gives the orders. Power flows downward from the top of the hierarchy to the bottom. But the most sophisticated and most durable form of leadership operates on precisely the opposite principle. It leads from behind. It shapes outcomes by appearing to facilitate rather than to direct. It holds power by giving it away, and exercises influence by making others believe they are exercising it themselves. This is the law of the stepped-back leader, and it is the form of leadership that produces the most loyal followers, the most genuinely motivated teams, the most creative and resilient organizations, and the most sustained influence over time. Because when people believe they are self-directed, when they experience their choices and commitments as genuinely their own rather than as imposed from above, they bring to those choices and commitments a quality of energy and ownership that no amount of external direction can produce. The psychological foundation of this law is the concept of self-attribution. When we experience ourselves as the source of our own behavior, when we believe we chose something rather than being made to choose it, the behavior is experienced as expressive of identity. It becomes who we are rather than what we were told to do. And behaviors that are expressive of identity are extraordinarily durable, because to abandon them would require a revision of the self, which is far more psychologically costly than simply refusing an instruction. The stepped-back leader understands this principle and deliberately engineers conditions in which others experience their own best choices as genuinely their own. They do this not by being absent or uninvolved, but by being present in the specific ways that guide without appearing to direct. They ask questions that lead thinking in productive directions without telling people what to think. They create the conditions in which the right conclusions become available without naming those conclusions for people. They frame situations in ways that make the desired choices feel natural and obvious without making the framing visible. The first technique within this law is what we might call the technique of the Socratic guide. Instead of telling, asking. Instead of presenting the answer, presenting the question that leads toward the answer. Instead of explaining the conclusion, creating the experience that makes the conclusion feel self-evident. The Socratic guide is not absent from the conversation. They are, in fact, one of its most important presences. But they are present as a questioner and an explorer rather than as an authority and an explainer. And the people who engage with them come away feeling that their own thinking produced the insight, which is both true and untrue at the same time. The insight was theirs, but the conditions that made it possible were not accidental. The second technique is what we might call the technique of the deliberate consultation. The stepped-back leader asks the people around them for their opinions, and genuinely listens to those opinions and incorporates them visibly into decisions. They do not simply perform consultation while having already decided. They create genuine space for others' thinking to influence outcomes, and in doing so, they create something remarkable. A group of people who are genuinely invested in those outcomes, because the outcomes were genuinely shaped by their input. This is the paradox of power sharing that most authority holders find deeply counterintuitive. Giving away influence increases it. When people feel that their voice genuinely matters in the shaping of a direction, they become advocates for that direction. When they feel that a direction was imposed on them, they become potential resistors. The stepped-back leader has a following of genuine advocates because those advocates were genuinely involved in creating what they are advocating for. The third technique is the technique of the attributed idea. When a useful idea from one of your followers is noticed, named, and credited to them publicly, several things happen simultaneously. The idea's originator becomes more invested in seeing it succeed because it is now associated with their identity and their reputation. Others in the group observe that good ideas are credited rather than taken, which encourages them to contribute ideas rather than hoarding them. And the leader, paradoxically, gains more power by giving away the credit than by taking it, because the act of generous attribution marks them as someone who lifts others up rather than competing with them. The stepped-back leader is often the most powerful person in any room, precisely because they appear to be the least powerful. Because the most powerful form of influence is the influence that does not look like influence. That moves through a system without producing resistance. That creates outcomes without leaving the fingerprints of direction on them. And the person who has mastered this form of leadership has found the deepest expression of the law of reverse control. The more completely you release the need to be seen as the source of power, the more completely power will flow through you. Law 5. The law of emotional withdrawal. Remove your reaction to reclaim your position. Every dynamic of emotional manipulation depends on one thing: your reaction. Without your reaction, the manipulation has nothing to feed on. Without your visible distress, the person provoking it loses their leverage. Without your anger, the one who triggered it loses their ability to predict and direct your behavior. Without your need for resolution, the one withholding resolution loses their power over the timeline. This is the law of emotional withdrawal, and it is one of the most practically powerful laws in this entire book. Not because emotions themselves are problems. Emotions are information, and they are real, and they matter. But the visible expression of emotion, particularly in contexts where someone is using your emotional reactions as a mechanism of control, is the precise point of vulnerability that they are exploiting. And the withdrawal of that expression, the cultivation of what we might call a strategic emotional composure, is the act that removes their leverage. The psychology of this law operates through what game theorists call the response elimination. In any interactive dynamic, the person who can predict your response has a significant advantage over you. They know what they need to do to produce the reaction they want from you, and they can adjust their behavior accordingly to keep producing it. Your predictable emotional reaction is essentially a set of instructions they can follow to keep you in the position they want you in. When you remove the predictable reaction, when you respond to provocation with calm, to manipulation with thoughtful inquiry, to emotional escalation with measured de-escalation, you eliminate the instructions. You become unpredictable in exactly the way that most undermines the other party's strategy, because their strategy depends on your reaction, and you have stopped providing one. This is not the suppression of emotion. It is the decoupling of internal emotional experience from external behavioral expression. You may feel exactly the anger or hurt or anxiety that the other person is trying to provoke. The work is not to pretend that you do not feel it. The work is to develop enough of a gap between feeling it and expressing it that you have genuine choice about whether, how, and when to express it. That gap, that pause between stimulus and response, is one of the most important spaces in the psychology of interpersonal power. Because in that space lives choice. The choice of whether to react in the way that was anticipated and that serves the other person's agenda, or to respond in the way that serves yours. The first application of this law is in situations of direct confrontation. When someone escalates emotionally, matching their escalation feels natural and may even feel righteous. But it is almost always a mistake in terms of power dynamics. Escalating in response to escalation confirms that their escalation has had an effect on you. It elevates the conflict to a register where rational analysis is no longer possible. And it gives the person who escalated first the thing they wanted, which was to move the interaction out of the domain of clear thinking and into the domain of reactive emotion, where they may have significant home field advantage. The response that most reliably resets the dynamic is what we might call the grounded non-escalation. A calm, measured acknowledgement of what is happening without matching its emotional intensity. Something as simple as, "I can see this matters a great deal to you. I want to understand it. Can we talk about it when the temperature is lower?" This response does several things simultaneously. It demonstrates that you are not going to be dragged into an escalating dynamic. It signals that you have empathy without having been destabilized. And it gently but firmly redirects the conversation toward a register in which you have considerably more advantage. The second application is in situations of chronic emotional manipulation, where someone has established a pattern of using your emotional reactions to maintain control over a dynamic. In these situations, the withdrawal of your predictable reaction is not a single event. It is a sustained practice of responding differently, consistently enough and long enough that the pattern is genuinely disrupted. This is difficult. It requires maintaining composure in situations specifically designed to prevent it. It requires enduring what often feels like escalating provocation as the other party, finding that their usual trigger is not producing the usual reaction, pushes harder to restore the dynamic they are accustomed to. This escalation, before the pattern eventually breaks, is in fact evidence that the approach is working. It is the last effort of the strategy before it collapses, but getting through it requires genuine psychological strength and genuine commitment to the shift. The third application is perhaps the most subtle, the withdrawal of the anxious response to uncertainty. In relationships and negotiations where another party uses uncertainty, including silence, delayed responses, and withheld decisions, as a mechanism of control, the anxious pursuit of certainty is the reaction they are counting on. Your need for resolution is their leverage. The moment you genuinely develop a tolerance for unresolved uncertainty, waiting comfortably while they decide, remaining productively engaged elsewhere while the outcome is pending, their primary tool of control dissolves. Law 6, the law of the strategic concession. Give a little to gain everything. There is an art form in negotiation and influence that most people never learn because it feels wrong on its surface. It is the art of the strategic concession, the deliberate, calculated decision to give up something of lesser value in order to gain something of greater value. To lose the battle you do not actually need to win in order to secure the war that matters. To be wrong about the small thing in order to be believed when you are right about the big thing. The psychology behind this law rests on the principle of reciprocity, one of the most powerful and most consistent forces in human social behavior. When someone gives you something, whether it is a gift, a service, a piece of information, or a concession in a negotiation, you feel a corresponding impulse to give something in return. This impulse is so deep in the structure of human social psychology that it operates even when you are aware of it. Even when you know that the gift was calculated, even when you suspect that the generosity has a strategic motive. Robert Cialdini, in his landmark work on the psychology of influence, documented this phenomenon extensively and found it to be one of the most reliable levers of human behavior across virtually every cultural context he examined. The reciprocity drive is, in evolutionary terms, one of the mechanisms that made human cooperation possible. And it is, in the domain of influence, one of the most powerful tools available. The strategic concession works by activating this reciprocity drive in a targeted way. When you concede something to another party, particularly something that they have been pushing for or that they believe matters to you, They experience the pull to reciprocate. They feel, often without being able to articulate why, that they owe you something in return, that the dynamic of give and take has been momentarily tilted in your favor, and that equity requires them to give something back. But the strategic concession is only strategic if what you are giving is worth less than what you are positioning yourself to receive in return. This requires a clear-eyed analysis of what each party in the dynamic actually values, which is often quite different from what they say they value. In any negotiation or influence situation, there are positions and there are interests. Positions are what people say they want. Interests are what they actually need. A strategic concession on a position can produce enormous gain in terms of interests, because the position may have been a proxy or a symbol for the underlying interest rather than the interest itself. The classic example is the negotiation in which each party states a fixed price position. One wants to pay less, one wants to receive more. If both parties argue their position, they reach an impasse. But if one party looks beneath the position to the interest, they may discover that the other party is actually more concerned about payment timing than payment amount. A concession on timing, which costs the conceding party very little, can unlock the price concession that appeared to be completely off the table. The law of the strategic concession also applies in interpersonal and relational contexts far removed from formal negotiation. In a conflict where two people have argued themselves into opposing corners, the party that concedes first, that says genuinely and specifically, "You were right about that, and I was wrong," does something remarkable. They change the entire emotional register of the interaction. The defensiveness of the other party, which was sustained partly by the need to maintain their position against attack, loses some of its necessity. And in that moment of lowered defense, genuine conversation becomes possible in a way that it was not when both sides were fully armored. The concession here is not weakness. It is sophistication. It is the recognition that being right about everything in an argument is far less valuable than preserving the relationship and creating the conditions for genuine mutual understanding. And the party that makes the first genuine concession almost always gains more from the interaction than the party that held their ground until the end. The strategic concession is also a powerful tool in the management of one's own reputation and credibility. The person who never concedes, who is always right in their own accounting, who has no visible blind spots or errors of judgment, loses credibility rather than gaining it. Because we all know that no one is always right, and the person who appears to think they are provokes the kind of careful scrutiny that looks for the cracks in their apparently perfect record. Whereas the person who acknowledges their errors with grace and precision, who says clearly and without excessive self-flagellation, "I got that wrong, and here is what I have learned from it," builds a reputation for honesty and self-awareness that increases rather than decreases their overall credibility. Give a little. Give it consciously, clearly, and in the places where it costs you least and gains you most. And watch how the reciprocity drive in those around you does the rest of the work. Law 7. The law of the planted seed. Influence without appearing to influence. The most visible form of influence is also the least effective. The direct pitch, the open argument, the explicit persuasion attempt. All of these are transparent in their intent, and transparency of persuasive intent is one of the primary triggers of psychological resistance. When people know they are being persuaded, something in them automatically becomes more critical, more skeptical, more defensive. The very fact of the persuasion attempt becomes evidence that they should not immediately agree. The law of the planted seed operates on the opposite principle. Instead of openly attempting to change someone's mind, you introduce an idea in the most indirect possible way, without argument, without pressure, without even a visible interest in whether the other person accepts it. You plant it in the soil of their thinking, and then you step back and let it grow on its own roots. And when it eventually flowers into their conscious consideration, they experience it not as something that was placed there by you, but as something that grew from their own thinking. This is the most sophisticated and the most ethically complex form of influence, because it is the hardest to trace. When someone acts on an idea that they believe is genuinely their own, Their commitment to it is deep, and their satisfaction in it is genuine. But the person who planted the original seed has influenced the outcome without ever appearing to have tried to. The technique of seed planting works through several specific mechanisms. The first is what we might call the technique of the offhand mention. Rather than presenting an idea as a proposal to be evaluated and accepted or rejected, you mention it in passing, briefly and without apparent investment, as one observation among several. I was reading something interesting the other day about how organizations that try this approach tend to see a different kind of result. And then you move on. You do not pursue it. You do not elaborate beyond what genuine curiosity might prompt. You leave the idea sitting lightly in the conversation and let the other person carry it away if something in them responds to it. The second mechanism is the technique of the attributed success. Rather than recommending a course of action directly, you discuss, with genuine enthusiasm, how someone else used that approach and what they experienced. Not as an argument. Not as a comparison that implies the listener should do the same. Simply as an interesting story about someone else's experience. The implicit logic of the story does the persuasive work. The listener draws their own conclusions, and the conclusions they draw feel like their own reasoning rather than like your recommendation. The third mechanism is the technique of the question that contains the answer. A well-constructed question can introduce an idea more effectively than any statement because questions engage the listener's thinking rather than their defenses. What would it look like if you approached it from that direction? It is not a statement about what they should do. It is an invitation to imagine. And once the imagination has engaged with the picture the question creates, the idea has entered the thinking without having announced itself as an argument to be evaluated. The law of the planted seed requires genuine patience. The timeline of indirect influence is always longer than the timeline of direct pressure. You plant and you wait. You create conditions and you observe. You trust the process of another person's own thinking rather than trying to shortcut it. And this patience is itself a form of respect. The respect of trusting another person's mind to do good work when it is given the right raw material and the right conditions for genuine thinking. Law 8. The law of the mirror dynamic. Reflect people back to themselves to move them forward. Human beings are profoundly shaped by how they are seen by others, and specifically by how they see themselves reflected in others' perceptions. We are not self-contained vessels of fixed identity. We are dynamic, responsive, socially constructed in ways that are continuously being updated by the quality of attention and recognition we receive from the people around us. And this means that the way you hold another person in your perception, the story you tell about who they are and what they are capable of, is not a passive observation. It is an active influence on the very reality it appears merely to describe. This is the law of the mirror dynamic, and it is, in its most powerful application, not a manipulation, but a gift. The gift of being seen as who you could be rather than who you have been. The classic articulation of this principle in social science is the Pygmalion effect, documented in research on educational outcomes. When teachers were told that certain randomly selected students were about to experience significant intellectual growth, those students did in fact experience greater growth than their peers. Not because the prediction was accurate, but because the teacher's belief in the students' potential changed how they interacted with them. They gave them harder problems. They communicated higher expectations. They interpreted their errors as steps in a learning process rather than as evidence of limitation. And the students, held in this more expansive perception, rose toward it. The mirror dynamic works in every context where one person has the capacity to define, for another person, what they see when they look at them. The manager who holds their team member in a perception of someone capable of growth, who speaks to them as if they are already on the way to becoming what they could be, who treats their current limitations as temporary conditions rather than permanent features, creates in that team member a self-perception that moves in the direction of the mirror. The parent who reflects back to the child an image of someone brave, curious, and capable creates a self-conception in the child that supports brave, curious, capable behavior. The mentor who tells the student, "I see in you the capacity to do something genuinely significant," I see it more clearly than you do right now, and I am willing to invest in it. Creates in the student an aspiration that is attached to the relationship and powered by the quality of the reflection. The technique of the mirror dynamic in practice involves several specific elements. The first is the element of specific recognition. Vague praise, "You are really talented, you are so good at this," creates a moment of pleasant feeling but does not fundamentally change self-perception. Specific recognition, the precise naming of a particular capability or quality with clear evidence and clear language, creates a much more durable shift. You approached that problem in a way I have not seen many people approach it. You held complexity and kept track of all the variables without losing the main point. That is a real capacity, and it matters. This specificity tells the person that you actually saw them, not a generic positive projection, but their specific reality. And being specifically seen is one of the most powerful experiences in human psychology. The second element is the element of the articulated potential. Beyond what you currently see in the person, you speak to what you believe they are capable of becoming, not as a pressure or an expectation they must meet, but as a genuine expression of your belief in a future version of them that is larger than the current one. You may not see this in yourself yet, but I see it clearly. The person you are growing into is someone who can navigate this kind of thing with real authority. That articulation of potential creates a mental image, and mental images of a possible self have extraordinary motivating power. The person begins to orient toward the image. They begin to grow into the mirror you have held up for them. The third element is the element of consistent witnessing. The mirror dynamic is not created in a single interaction. It is created over time, through the consistent quality of attention and recognition you bring to a person. When someone knows that you see them clearly and hold them in a genuinely positive and expansive perception, that consistent experience becomes part of how they see themselves. Your mirror becomes, over time, part of their internal mirror, and the image they carry of themselves is partly an internalization of the way you have held them. This is why the most influential people in most people's lives are not those who gave them the most advice or the most direction. They are those who held them most clearly and most generously in their perception. Who saw something in them, perhaps before they saw it in themselves, and who communicated that seeing in a way that made it real. Law 9. The law of the calibrated absence. Be missed to be valued. Presence is powerful. But absence, strategically calibrated, can be even more powerful, because presence establishes what you are. Absence creates space for the imagination to work, and the imagination, left to fill a space where something valued used to be, almost always produces a more intensely felt version of that thing than the thing itself. This is the law of the calibrated absence, and it operates through one of the most consistent features of human psychology. The tendency to take for granted what is continuously present, and to acutely feel the loss of what is suddenly absent. The water that runs constantly from the tap is not particularly noticed. The water that suddenly stops flowing is noticed immediately and intensely. The friend who is always available is loved but not urgently needed. The friend who is suddenly away for a month is missed in a way that sharpens the quality of the relationship. The calibrated absence is not cruelty. It is not indifference performed for effect. It is the genuine cultivation of a life rich enough in purpose, interest, and direction that your absence from any particular relationship or context is a real, not a theatrical, consequence of your genuine engagement elsewhere. And the person who genuinely has somewhere else to be, who is genuinely engaged with things that matter to them, and who therefore does not fill every space and every moment with their presence in any single relationship, creates a quality of longing in those relationships that continuous presence never produces. The law of the calibrated absence has several specific applications. The first is in the domain of romantic and intimate relationships. The person who is always available, who responds to every message immediately, who fills every free moment with the other person's company, who makes the relationship the primary, if not exclusive focus of their emotional and social life, creates a condition in the relationship where the other person's need for them diminishes. Because what is always available cannot be longed for, and longing is one of the primary fuels of desire. The second application is in professional and creative contexts. The advisor or consultant or collaborator who is always on call, who is immediately responsive to every request, who makes themselves infinitely available, gradually loses the sense of value that scarcity creates. The person who is engaged and responsive but also clearly has other significant demands on their time, who is not immediately available but who is reliably reachable, creates around their services and their attention a quality of value that continuous availability eliminates. The third application is in the domain of ideas and expression. The writer who publishes everything they think, the thinker who shares every observation, the creator who is continuously producing and sharing output, loses something that the more selective communicator preserves. The sense that what they share has been chosen, that it represents something distilled and considered rather than everything that occurred to them, that it is the product of a selectivity that implies a larger body of private thought beyond what is shared publicly. And that sense of a private depth behind the public expression creates a quality of interest and attention that continuous output never achieves. The calibration in the law of the calibrated absence is critical. Too much absence produces not longing but replacement. The person who disappears entirely is not missed. They are mourned briefly and then adapted around. The art is in the timing and the degree, present enough to sustain genuine connection and genuine value, absent enough to create genuine longing and genuine appreciation for the presence when it returns. Law 10. The law of the agreed-upon frame. Win the definition to win the debate. Every conversation, every negotiation, every conflict, every attempt at influence takes place within a frame. A frame is the set of assumptions, definitions, and contextual understandings that determine how the content of the interaction is interpreted. And the party that controls the frame controls the meaning of everything that happens within it. This is the law of the agreed-upon frame, and it is one of the most intellectually sophisticated laws in this book, because it operates at a level that most people never examine. They focus on the content of their arguments, on what they are saying, and they miss the far more powerful question of the frame within which what they are saying will be heard and evaluated. A simple example. Consider the difference between these two framings of the same situation. Your product costs more than the competition's product. In a frame defined by cost minimization, this is a disadvantage that you must overcome, a problem to be explained away. In a frame defined by total value over time, the same fact is not a problem at all. It is evidence of superior quality and long-term economy. The fact has not changed. Only the frame has changed. But in different frames, the fact points in opposite directions. The person who arrives at an interaction with a pre-established frame, and who allows that frame to govern the interpretation of what follows, has an enormous advantage over the person who arrives without one, or who unconsciously accepts the other party's frame. Because within a frame, the options available, the criteria for success, and the meaning of any particular move are all determined by the frame itself. You can fight brilliantly within a frame that works against you and still lose. Or you can establish a frame that works in your favor and find that the fight is already largely won before it has formally begun. The technique of frame establishment operates through several specific moves. The first is the opening definition. The party that defines the key terms of the interaction in their opening moves has established the semantic ground on which the interaction will take place. If you define the conversation as being about value rather than cost, about the long term rather than the immediate, about quality rather than quantity, you have already shaped how everything that follows will be interpreted. The second technique is the reframe. When the other party has established a frame that works against your interests, the most effective response is not to argue within that frame, but to propose a different one. Not, you are wrong about the cost. It is actually reasonable. But I want to suggest that we are looking at this through the wrong lens entirely, and here is why a different lens produces a different picture. The reframe moves the conversation to a meta level, to the question of which framework is most appropriate, before returning to the content level within the new, more favorable frame. The third technique is the anchoring question. A well-chosen question can establish a frame more powerfully than any statement, because the question implies the frame without making it explicit. A statement of frame can be challenged directly. A frame implied by a question tends to be accepted without examination, because the mind immediately focuses on answering the question rather than on analyzing what the question assumed. What would this look like if we optimized for the outcome 10 years from now rather than the outcome next quarter? This question does not state that we should optimize for the long term, but it assumes that framing and invites the other party to engage with it. And engagement with the question is, effectively, acceptance of the frame. The law of the agreed-upon frame ultimately rests on a profound insight about the nature of human communication. There is no neutral, objective, frame-free way to discuss anything. Every conversation has a frame. The only question is whether it was established deliberately or accidentally. And the person who understands this is always choosing their frame deliberately, always asking themselves before any significant interaction, what frame works in my favor, and how do I establish it before the interaction begins? Law 11. The law of the reversed expectation. Surprise to create impact. Disappoint expectations to redefine them. Human attention is fundamentally tuned to notice the unexpected. Our nervous systems are prediction engines, constantly generating models of what will happen next and monitoring for deviations from those predictions. When events conform to predictions, they are registered but not emphasized. They are noise rather than signal. When events violate predictions, they light up the attention system and demand processing. They become memorable, significant, and powerful in a way that the expected event never becomes. This is the law of the reversed expectation, and it operates as a principle of influence because the person who controls what others expect from them controls, to a significant degree, what will make an impact on those others. Set a low expectation and then exceed it dramatically. Set an expectation of formality and then create a moment of genuine warmth. Set an expectation of conflict and then offer unexpected generosity. In each case, the reversal of expectation creates a moment of heightened attention and heightened emotional impact that the expected outcome would never have produced. The most memorable moments in any relationship, personal or professional, tend to be moments of positive expectation violation. The leader who was expected to take all the credit, and instead, publicly and specifically, credited their team. The negotiator who was expected to drive a hard bargain and instead made a generous and unexpected concession. The person who was expected to retaliate for a slight, and instead responded with disarming good humor. Each of these moments creates an impression that is disproportionately strong relative to the act itself, because the strength of the impression is partly a product of the gap between what was expected and what occurred. Managing expectations deliberately is therefore one of the most important skills in the psychology of reverse influence. The sophisticated operator is always conscious of what impression they have created in others' minds about what to expect from them, and they manage that impression strategically, sometimes deliberately setting lower expectations than they intend to meet, sometimes creating an expectation of conventional behavior so that unconventional behavior will land with maximum impact. The reversed expectation is also a powerful tool in the management of one's own reputation over time. The person who always meets expectations, who is reliably good but never surprising, occupies a stable but unexciting position in others' perception. They are trusted, but not riveting, valued, but not magnetic. The person who occasionally, deliberately, and at well-chosen moments significantly exceeds or reverses expectations creates a quality of attention and interest in those around them that consistency alone can never produce. Law 12. The law of strategic vulnerability. Show weakness to demonstrate strength. There is a form of strength that most people never develop because it looks on the surface like weakness. It is the strength of genuine vulnerability. The capacity to reveal something real and imperfect about yourself, not as a confession or an apology, but as a demonstration of confidence so complete that you do not need the protection of an unblemished image. The law of strategic vulnerability rests on a paradox that is deeply counterintuitive but empirically well supported. The person who reveals genuine weakness in the right context appears stronger than the person who maintains a flawless facade. Because we all know that flawless facades are performances. We know that everyone has limitations, doubts, failures, and fears. And the person who performs the absence of these things triggers in us a quiet skepticism, a distrust of the performance that makes the person behind it feel less real and less reliable. Whereas the person who reveals a genuine limitation, who says, "I struggled with this for a long time before I figured it out," or "I am not naturally good at this kind of thing, but I have worked on it," or "I was wrong about this and it cost me," creates in us a different response, a response of recognition, of trust, of the sense that we are dealing with a real human being who has the confidence to be one. And that trust is a foundation for influence that the defended, flawless performance never builds. The strategic element of this law is in the choice of what to reveal. Genuine strategic vulnerability is not the dumping of all weakness indiscriminately. It is the selected, deliberate, contextually appropriate revelation of specific human imperfections that increase rather than decrease trust. The vulnerability that serves you is the vulnerability that your audience can relate to, that does not undermine your core competence in the area you are asking them to trust you in, and that is delivered with the kind of equanimity that signals you have genuinely processed it rather than that you are currently drowning in it. Law 13. The law of the deferred victory. Let others win the small thing to win the important thing. In any ongoing relationship, whether personal or professional, there is a continuous negotiation of small things. Who decides? Whose preference prevails? Whose interpretation of events is accepted as authoritative? And most people, driven by the short game psychology we explored earlier, treat each of these small negotiations as if it were a final battle. They hold their position on the small thing. They insist on being right. They claim the small victory. And they pay for it with something far more valuable. The law of the deferred victory is built on a simple but powerful insight. In any ongoing relationship, goodwill is a more valuable asset than being right. The person who consistently, graciously, and without apparent strategy, lets others have the small win accumulate something over time that far exceeds the value of every small win they have surrendered. They accumulate a reputation for generosity. They accumulate a balance of goodwill in the relational account that becomes enormous leverage when the genuinely important battle finally arrives. Because the genuinely important battle is coming. In every significant relationship, there will eventually be a moment that actually matters, a decision with real stakes, a conflict with real consequences. And in that moment, the person who has been generous about the small things over time has allies. They have goodwill. They have the moral authority that comes from a visible pattern of not insisting on their own way in every small instance. The person who has won every small battle, on the other hand, has spent that relational capital. They may have the right answer in the important moment, but they are operating from a relational deficit rather than a relational surplus. People are not especially inclined to defer to them, because the relationship has established a pattern of contest rather than collaboration. And the moment that matters most is exactly the wrong moment to try to establish a new pattern from scratch. Letting others win the small thing is not weakness. It is the long-term investment of someone who knows which battles actually matter and is patient enough to save their full strength for them. Law 14. The law of the returning tide. What you send out comes back amplified. Every principle in this book, every law of reverse psychology, every strategy of indirect influence, every technique of stepped-back leadership and strategic vulnerability and calibrated absence rests ultimately on a single, foundational law of human relations. The law that everything you send out into the world of your relationships comes back to you, not always in the same form, not always from the same direction, but with a consistency and a reliability that rewards genuine attention. When you send out genuine respect, what comes back is genuine respect. Not always from the same person, not always immediately, but as a quality of environment that slowly but unmistakably surrounds the person who gives it consistently. When you send out genuine generosity, what comes back is not always the gratitude of the person you were generous to, but something deeper, a reputation and a relational ecosystem in which generosity is the expected and normal mode of exchange. When you send out manipulation, what eventually comes back is the awareness of manipulation, and the erosion of exactly the trust and goodwill that manipulation was trying to secure. Because manipulation, however sophisticated, always contains an implicit message about how the manipulator regards the people they are manipulating. And people receive that message, usually not consciously, but at the level of felt sense. They may not be able to name what feels wrong, but they feel it. And over time, they act on it. The law of the returning tide is not a spiritual assertion. It is a practical observation about the mechanics of reputation, trust, and social ecology. The person who treats others as instruments to be managed will eventually find themselves in an environment of managed instruments, where no one is genuinely on their side, where every alliance is a transaction waiting to be revised when a better offer arrives, where the landscape of human connection is arid and exhausting. The person who treats others as genuine human beings whose interests matter and whose well-being is worth caring about will find themselves in an environment rich with genuine connection, genuine loyalty, and the kind of support that does not need to be purchased or manipulated into existence, because it is the natural response of human beings to human beings who have genuinely cared for them. This is the deepest law in this book, and in some sense it contains all the others. The 14 laws of reverse psychology are not a set of techniques for manipulating the world more efficiently. They are a framework for engaging with the world more intelligently, more patiently, and more honestly. They work not because they are clever tricks, but because they are aligned with how human psychology actually works, rather than how we imagine it should work. The person who wants less creates more desire. The person who applies less pressure creates more movement. The person who leads from behind creates more genuine following. The person who reveals genuine vulnerability creates more genuine trust. The person who defers the small victories accumulates the capital for the large ones. And the person who sends out genuine respect, genuine care, and genuine interest in the well-being of others creates, over time, an environment that amplifies and returns those qualities in ways that transform not just their relationships but their entire experience of what it means to move through the world with other human beings. This is the ultimate law of reverse control. Stop trying to control the world, and the world becomes more manageable. Stop trying to force outcomes, and outcomes begin to move in your direction. Stop performing power, and genuine power becomes available. The paradox is real. The laws are tested.